The biggest blow to the strict out-of-Africa theory or replacement model didn't come from a fossil. It didn't come from a stone tool or a tooth or a jaw. It came from a single gene fragment, MC1R, the master switch of human pigmentation, extracted from the bones of Mediterranean Neanderthals who lived tens of thousands of years before Homo sapiens ever set foot in Europe. This single genetic discovery reopened a door that had been slammed shut by the replacement model, the door to continuity, to regional evolution, and to the possibility that European traits were not recently evolved, but inheritances from an earlier Eurasian population shaped by its own environment. And with that door now forced open again, something else crawled out. Something that early anthropologists had spoken of boldly a century ago, only to have their ideas buried beneath the fashionable simplicity of the late 20th century. The discovery resurrected the work of early 20th century anthropologists whose insights had been marginalized by later generations. Scholars who examined Neanderthal fossils with remarkable accuracy long before the advent of genetic analysis. They observed similarities between Neanderthals and later Europeans that could not be ignored. They argued that Neanderthals were not a dead-end species, but a crucial phase in the evolution of Eurasian populations. Early 20th century anthropologists recognized regionally evolving lineages in Europe that predated the arrival of Homo sapiens and insisted that Neanderthals belonged within humanity rather than outside it. These scholars were dismissed when the replacement doctrine became fashionable, not because their evidence was weak, but because their conclusions were inconvenient. The replacement theory required a narrative of pure origins and clean separations. It could not tolerate deep continuity, complex regional evolution, or long-term admixture. As a result, the early anthropologists were condemned as outdated relics of a pre-genetic era. Their insights were not refuted, they were simply ignored. And if they could see how their ideas were buried only to emerge again under a new name, they would roll over in their graves. The MC1R discovery restored their credibility. It demonstrated that European traits have an evolutionary depth that the replacement model could not account for. It revealed that Neanderthals contributed biologically meaningful adaptations to modern human populations. It proved that the early anthropologists correctly identified the Mediterranean and Eurasian roots of European variability. Their arguments had been buried beneath layers of theoretical dogma, but ancient DNA has now unearthed them. When anthropologists first handled the heavy-browed skull from the north face of Gibraltar in the mid-19th century, they were struck by a strange mixture of the familiar and the foreign. The skull was clearly ancient, its brow ridges pronounced and its forehead retreating, yet it was not the monstrous caricature later generations would imagine. It looked human, and disturbingly so. Human enough that Charles Darwin asked to have it carried to his home so he could examine it himself in the lamplight. At the time, the fossil record was astonishingly thin. The Neander Valley skull had only recently been unearthed, and no one yet knew how many such forms existed across Europe and the Near East. But something about the Lady of Gibraltar, also known as the Forbes Quarry skull, hinted that the story of Europe's deep past was not one of simple replacement. It suggested something more tangled, more continuous, and more ancient than the clean, linear model that would dominate the 20th century. Long before genetics revolutionized our understanding of human origins, some early anthropologists believed that the people of Europe carried echoes of a deeper lineage, one that stretched back to Pleistocene ancestors often labeled primitive or extinct. These researchers looked at skull shapes, proportions, pigmentation, and the geographic spread of ancient remains. They lived in a world without radiocarbon dating or ancient DNA, yet they saw patterns that would be dismissed for decades as outdated or unscientific. The 20th century, especially the late century period, dominated by the replacement theory framework, brushed aside these early insights. Neanderthals were declared evolutionary dead ends, replaced entirely by incoming waves of modern humans. Continuity in any form was not just unfashionable, it was heretical. Yet today, a growing body of evidence suggests that the early observers were not as misguided as they were made to appear. The discovery of ancient Neanderthal genomes has shown that almost all people alive today carry a small but meaningful percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. The discovery of Neanderthal genes in nearly every population destroyed the claim of genetic purity. But genetic fragments are only the beginning of the story. More subtle than the simple percentages are the traits themselves, the shape of the skull, the proportions of the face, and perhaps most evocatively, the evolution of red and blonde hair in Eurasia. These traits do not align neatly with a model of sudden replacement. They follow instead a deeper curve, one shaped by environmental pressures that long predated the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe. The earliest expressions of these Eurasian features appear in the Neanderthal populations of the eastern Mediterranean. The story begins in the limestone caves at the site of Tabun on the eastern Mediterranean. The Neanderthal known as the Lady of Tabun lived roughly 120,000 to 130,000 years ago, during a warm interval when the Mediterranean woodlands stretched down the coast, and Neanderthals occupied territories long thought to belong exclusively to our own ancestors. Her skull is a remarkable fusion of ancient and advanced traits, but what matters most for this narrative is the ecological context in which she lived. The eastern Mediterranean of the Eemian was not the blazing desert it can be today. It was a region of moderate ultraviolet light, shifting cloud cover and dappled forests. Under such conditions, organisms relying heavily on visual acuity, like Neanderthals, whose large eye sockets show they were highly adapted for seeing in low light, faced strong ecological pressures that later echoed across Eurasia. Reduced melanin, achieved through mutations like the Neanderthal MC1R variant, would have improved and enhanced visual contrast, especially in twilight or shade. This mutation, found in Western Neanderthal populations in Italy and Spain, likely first arose in a population very much like that represented by the Lady of Tabun. In this corner of the world, the first steps toward modernity were taken. Neanderthals had occupied Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived. They faced the same shortage of winter sunlight and the same visual challenges in low-light environments. It is therefore no surprise that genetic pathways affecting melanin production began shifting toward lighter pigmentation long before modern humans settled the continent. The MC1R mutation discovered in Italian and Spanish Neanderthal remains is direct evidence of this. It is a gene that reduces eumelanin and increases pheomelanin, producing reddish or chestnut shades of hair in modern humans. That a Neanderthal population carried a variant with the same effect is not coincidence. It is continuity. From the eastern Mediterranean, these early Neanderthal populations moved northward and westward as climates cooled. Their path is written in the fossil record. As these western Neanderthal groups moved along the Mediterranean arc, through the Balkans and into southern Europe, they carried with them the mutations that began in their ancestral homeland. The depigmenting MC1R variant, that later appears in the Italian site of Monte Lessini and in the Spanish site of El Cidrón, has deep roots in this population. The continuity of this trait is not just demographic, but ecological. By the time these Neanderthal populations reached Italy, they had undergone tens of thousands of years of regional evolution. The Italian peninsula, with its sheltered valleys, deep caves, and dramatic shifts in altitude, offered a unique environment in which pigmentation and morphology continued to evolve. Neanderthals in this region would have been exposed to lower ultraviolet levels than their ancestors, especially during glacial periods. The MC1R mutation, found in the Monte Lessini individual, became part of the local genetic landscape. Hair that ranged from dark blonde to auburn and light-coloured eyes adapted to deep forest shade were traits shaped not by a single species event, but by a continuous environmental pressure. These Western Neanderthals were not dark, brooding creatures stalking in perpetual gloom. This evolving Western lineage crossed into France as populations moved along the coast and into the Rhône corridor. There, in caves such as Grotta Mandrin, the traces of Western Neanderthals appear just before the arrival of modern humans. Their tools, their skeletal fragments, and the cultural remains they left behind reveal a population firmly rooted in the Mediterranean Neanderthal tradition, itself descended from the earlier groups to the east. Every step of their journey reflects a continuity of adaptation, culture, and morphology that contradicts the later notion of a tidy biological boundary separating Neanderthals from early modern Europeans. The final chapter of this story rests in Gibraltar, where the Lady of Gibraltar lived and died sometime between 50 and 70,000 years ago. Her skull, one of the first Neanderthal fossils ever found, is perhaps the most poignant symbol of continuity. Unlike some of the heavily built northern Neanderthal specimens, the Gibraltar skull has features that strike modern observers as surprisingly human. Her brow ridges, though prominent, are not a single heavy bar but a pair of arches. Her face is broad, but not grotesque. Her cranium, long and rounded, is within the upper range of modern human variation. If she lived today and walked into a Mediterranean city, many people would simply see her as a muscular, strong-featured woman with a distinctive profile. What makes the Lady of Gibraltar even more significant is her position at the end of a long westward arc of Neanderthal evolution. Her ancestors were the populations of the eastern Mediterranean. They travelled west to Italy and into Iberia, carrying with them the genetic seeds of lighter pigmentation and the morphological traits shaped by millennia of Eurasian adaptation. She represents the culmination of this continuity. Her skull is not a relic of a vanished evolutionary detour, but part of the same ecological story that would shape later European populations. The replacement model struggled to accommodate this picture. It proposed that modern humans entered Eurasia around 60,000 years ago, fully formed, replacing Neanderthal populations without interbreeding and without genetic contribution. Every time new evidence challenged this narrative, the model was revised. When fossils older than 70,000 years appeared in the eastern Mediterranean, the model was patched with claims of failed migrations. When genetic data revealed a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry in modern humans, the model was patched again, now claiming limited interbreeding, but insisting that Neanderthals left no meaningful traits behind. When pigmentation genes in early Europeans suggested that they, too, underwent depigmentation within Eurasia, the model required yet another modification. Each revision kept the core of the hypothesis intact, but the patches grew thick enough that the underlying structure became hard to defend. What the continuity perspective offers instead is a simpler, more elegant explanation. The traits seen in modern Europeans, varying shades of light hair, large and often deep-set eyes, did not emerge abruptly with the arrival of Homo sapiens. They unfolded gradually in the populations that had long inhabited Eurasia, beginning in the eastern Mediterranean more than 100,000 years before modern humans arrived. Charles Darwin, too, anticipated this complexity long before genetics existed. Darwin recognized that human variation evolved gradually, forming gradients rather than discrete categories. He rejected the idea that the differences between human populations could be explained by single events or abrupt separations. His analysis in The Descent of Man emphasized variability, overlap, and the slow transformations of regional populations. Darwin warned against viewing human evolution in simple binaries. He insisted that the evolution of our species would have been shaped by a long chain of interactions, modifications, and interbreeding among populations adapted to different environments. His intuition aligns perfectly with what genetics now reveals. The evolution of Homo sapiens in Eurasia was not a clean takeover. It was a synthesis of lineages. Neanderthals, shaped by these same ecological pressures, evolved pigmentation traits that parallel those seen in later Europeans. When modern humans entered Europe and inevitably interbred with the resident Neanderthals, they absorbed not just genes, but features, adaptations, and perhaps even subtle aspects of appearance that had been shaped over vast stretches of Pleistocene time. The story of Neanderthals and Europeans is not one of replacement, but of convergence, adaptation, and deep continuity. Early anthropologists, with their limited tools but attentive eyes, sensed this connection, even if their methods and theories were imperfect. The fossils at Darwin and Gibraltar show that the roots of European pigmentation and morphology are older than Homo sapiens in Europe. They belong to a broader narrative, one written in the limestone caves of the Mediterranean and carried westward across continents. The people who lived in those caves were not evolutionary failures. They were the first Europeans, and their legacy survives in the features of millions of people today. The replacement model failed not only because genetic and archaeological evidence contradicted it, but because it conflicted with the fundamental principles of evolutionary biology. The model demanded a scenario that violated known patterns of adaptation, population dynamics, biogeography, and ecological selection. Evolution is not a process that resets with the arrival of a new population. It is a cumulative process that builds upon existing adaptations. Lineages do not erase the evolutionary history of the regions they enter. They merge with it, adapt to it, and are shaped by its pressures. The replacement model required that Homo sapiens ignored this rule entirely. It insisted that migrants could enter unfamiliar environments dramatically different from those in which their ancestors evolved, and succeed without acquiring adaptations from the populations that had been living in those environments for hundreds of thousands of years. This assumption is biologically implausible. If Homo sapiens had arrived in Europe without absorbing adaptively significant traits from Neanderthals, they would have faced severe disadvantages. They would have lacked local immune system variants, pigmentation adaptations, metabolic pathways suited for low-light environments, robust cold-weather physiology, and sensory configurations optimized for European latitudes. As Darwin wrote, natural selection would have penalized this group severely, and the probability of their establishment would have been extremely low. However, the evidence shows that Homo sapiens succeeded in Europe relatively quickly. The only plausible explanation is that they acquired adaptive traits from Neanderthals through admixture. The replacement doctrine did not collapse because of ideological shifts. It collapsed because evidence accumulated faster than the believers in the model were willing to revise their assumptions. The model demanded an abrupt replacement of all archaic populations by a single wave of modern humans approximately 60 to 70,000 years ago. It required genetic purity, and it required the complete disappearance of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other lineages. It required that all modern traits, including pigmentation, craniofacial architecture, immune adaptations, and sensory biology, must have emerged in a Garden of Eden and spread outward in a single clean sweep. However, science is not obligated to satisfy narrative convenience. It is obligated to pursue truth, even when truth is complicated, multi-layered, and resistant to sweeping generalizations. The replacement doctrine substituted clarity for accuracy. It offered a story of genetic purity rather than a story of regional interactions. It invoked cognitive superiority to justify replacement rather than recognizing ecological and demographic complexities. It marginalized contradictory evidence rather than integrating it. The replacement model cannot explain this evidence, and no amount of conceptual patchwork can mend its contradictions. Human evolutionary theory has undergone many transformations, but no doctrine captured the imagination of scientists and the public more fully than the replacement model. This model claimed that all modern humans descended from a single, genetically uniform and pure population that evolved approximately 60,000 years ago. According to this view, these migrants spread across the world, replacing all archaic populations with little or no interbreeding. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other Eurasian lineages were treated as evolutionary failures whose traits vanished completely when anatomically modern humans arrived. This idea appealed because it offered clarity, a clean replacement, a single origin, and a uniform evolutionary success story. It was as linear as a myth and as elegant as a simple equation. However, science does not accommodate myths for long. Evidence eventually demands correction. The discovery of Neanderthal admixture shattered the doctrinal purity of the replacement model. Neanderthals were never lost. They were never inferior. They were never erased. They were absorbed into the lineage that would inherit the world. And so the story of Europe, biological, cultural, evolutionary, is not the story of a people who arrived with everything they needed, but the story of a people who became who they are because of those who came before them. This is the legacy of the Neanderthals. This is the end of the replacement model. And this is the restored, uninterrupted truth of our shared evolutionary history. Thanks for watching.